Renaissance Humanism and Marxian Humanism by Bogdan Suchodolski. Bogdan Suchodolski was born in 1903 in Sosnowiec, Poland. He is head of the Institute of Educational Sciences at the University of Warsaw and a member of the Polish Academy of Arts and the Polish Academy of Science. He has published numerous books on educational philosophy and methods. Some of them are Socialized Culture, Polish Educational Thought During the Renaissance, Foundations of a Materialist Theory of Education, and Program for Secular Moral Education. During World War II, he taught at the Underground University of Warsaw, was pursued by the Gestapo, and forced into hiding. Whenever we talk about humanism, we see the conflict of two different attitudes. One of them holds that the term humanism refers to a complex of enduring values formulated centuries ago in antiquity, which was complemented by certain ideas of the Renaissance, values which are said to have the same significance for all men, irrespective of where and when they live. The other attitude is that the term humanism refers to an historically variable phenomenon, developing and transforming itself in a determined way in the course of centuries. There is no denying that the concept of man, and consequently of humanism as well, contains certain permanent elements. But these elements always exist concretely in the specific conditions of time and space, and are thus enriched both by the introduction of new elements and by keeping old elements alive. Man always exists here and now. His present existence is at least as important for determining his essence as the conviction that this essence is determined by historical determinants. From this point of view, the problems of humanism ought not to be confined to the problem of what men have always been and what men have always valued, but must also deal with what men are becoming in the course of historical development, what, under changing conditions, they desire and are working toward. The Renaissance first began to comprehend that man's genuine autonomy consisted not only in freedom vis-a-vis religious and philosophical authorities, but also in liberation from the slavery of the social world, which is in contradiction to humanity. The true man the Renaissance sought for and discovered was to be free from both the outer and inner priest, from the anti-humanistic forms. The true man the Renaissance sought for and discovered was to be free from both the, quote, outer and inner priest, from the anti-humanistic forms of life shaped by old feudal privileges, or by the new power of money. In perceiving the anti-humanism of these forms of life, the thinkers and artists of the Renaissance were posing the dramatic question: how can the true man be found, buried under conditions which show the real existing man to be his negation? From Petrarch and Boccaccio to such diarists as Cellini and Cardanus, from the painters of the Italian Quattrocento, through the portraits and self-portraits of Dürer down to Titian, multifarious knowledge about empirical human variety grew. Machiavelli was the first to state his philosophical conclusions. As historian and observer of contemporary life, politician and statesman, Machiavelli saw how men fought for power, how men succeeded, and how they succumbed to their adversaries. The question, who is man, was being interpreted as what is man like in his social and political life? But from the very moment that the empirical conceptions of man's cognition started to take shape, other questions arose. One question was whether the true man is really identical with the person who leads a certain life. The new empiricism took for granted all the manifestations of human life and credulously recorded them as authentic. But some thinkers asked whether the way man lives is the result of his nature or of the conditions and circumstances that oblige him to behave in one way and not another. To put on a certain costume and mask without revealing his true identity. The question was posed by Machiavelli's contemporary and adversary, Thomas More. More pointed out that the English peasants lived as thieves and criminals because the lords have removed their land from them and taken away their means of livelihood. More unmasked the social hypocrisy which punishes culprits compelled by forces beyond those culprits' control to commit a misdeed. In his Praise of Folly, More's friend, Erasmus of Rotterdam, took up the idea that man's way of life reveals the social structure and not man's nature. Picturing the world as a realm of stupidity, Erasmus showed how bishops and priests, Picturing the world as a realm of stupidity, Erasmus showed how bishops and princes, leaders and judges, scholars and writers yielded to stupidity. Until the, quote, true man seemed to be mad and had either to perish or to follow their example, that is, to wear the mask which his life and position required. Thus the king becomes king only by virtue of his crown and purple, the bishop by his mitre and crosier, the scientist by his robe and beret. However, this occurs merely in the world's eyes. The truth lies elsewhere. Criticism of empirical theory of man's cognition posed the basic problem of modern anthropology, i.e., the reciprocal relationship between the, quote, real man and the, quote, true man. Toward the end of the Renaissance, this question was posed most dramatically by Cervantes and Shakespeare, who demonstrated how true men, not fitting into the social conditions of life, had to perish or betray themselves. Renaissance humanism, which had started with the idea of liberating men from the trammels of the superhuman world of church metaphysics, thus posed a central problem of the philosophy of man, the problem of liberating man from the secular bonds laid upon all. Must real empirical man always be a negation of the true man? Will the true man never be able to be a real man? Will there always be a conflict between man and the world created by men? These were questions to which only utopian answers were being given when the Renaissance came to its close. One answer was given by Bacon, who believed that social progress could be achieved through the victories of science and technology over the brute forces of nature and over men's delusions. Another was given by Campanella, who believed in a social revolution that would liquidate private ownership and open a door to the development of science, technology, and art. Succeeding centuries continued to face these problems. If man was neither to appeal to religious authorities, nor to accept with docility the whole social reality as it existed, then he had to rely on his own intellect as the only force capable of understanding and guiding his life. Consequently, believers in the empirical concept of man began to value reason more and more highly as a factor to liberate man from conservatism and opportunism. Thus a new and almost paradoxical type of rationalism arose. Man's lot was to be improved rationally in terms of reality, or the situation as it existed. Acceptance of such reality was easy, so was criticism from a religious or metaphysical position, but evaluation of the situation within the limits of reality was a fundamental difficulty. Man, from this point of view, was a particularly complex being. Man lived in a world created by himself, which he, however, criticized. If man was not to resort to metaphysical criteria in his criticism, he had at his disposal only the historical and social experience of mankind. But he was obliged at the same time to evaluate this criterion. So I need to reread that last paragraph for myself because I was blanking out. Man, from this point of view, was a particularly complex being. He lived in a world created by himself, which he, however, criticized. If he was not to resort to metaphysical criteria in his criticism, he had at his disposal only the historical and social experience of mankind. But he was obliged at the same time to evaluate this criterion. Under these circumstances, the relationship between human reason and human reality emerged with a particular sharpness as the problem of the meaning of human history. Faced with a conflict between reason and history, to choose reason would be tantamount to renouncing history. That is, the only force at the disposal of man, who is a solitary being left on his own in the universe. Closely bound up with the conflict between reason and history was the conflict between reason and social reality, which was in essence the same conflict revealed in contemporary life. Philosophers of the 17th century were alarmed by the question, which is better, the choice of social institutions and the universally observed customs, or reason, particularly in its critical attitude toward society? As long as the social world could resort to a metaphysical or historical authority, the problem posed no difficulty. Wherever man was left alone to face his social reality, it became essential. In choosing the social reality, despite his own reason, man departed from what was most valuable in him, his critical consciousness, his ability to evaluate, his will to act. But in choosing the ideals of reason, despite social reality, he ran another risk. Who could be certain whether ideals not yet tested in social practice were correct? The conservatives were always of the opinion that it was better to do a stupid thing which had hitherto been done by other men than to do a wise thing which had never yet been done by anybody. If the ideals of reason were not to be guaranteed metaphysically, the testimony of social reality was their only confirmation. Under those conditions, was the social criterion of truth and falsehood to be rejected? The conflict between human reason and human reality, both in history and in contemporary society, was the principal subject of the deliberations concerning civilization, the social system, and man among the philosophers of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment stressed the idea that the reality within which people lived, people's institutions and views, ought to be transformed according to the requirements of reason. In perpetuating this concept, the Enlightenment saw the stages of its implementation and conceived of history as an avenue of progress leading towards the future. Thanks to this, the philosophy of man acquired, for the first time in history, a new dimension. True, the genealogy of the theory of progress goes back to earlier times, but it was only in the 1700s that the concept became a universally recognized and fruitful philosophy of history and of man. Man was seen as a being who not only created the conditions of his life, but also, in their historical transformations, progressed from one form of existence to another. It was then that philosophers for the first time ceased to answer the question, who is man, by indicating what men are like. They recognized that the differentiations within the human race, as recorded by historians and ethnographers, could be understood only when it was taken for granted that man is a being that evolves. One cannot define man's nature by summing up all the data. One can define it only by tracing its development and characterizing its stages of evolution. Thus, the Enlightenment could once again take up the problem of human reason in relation to human reality. It was possible to solve that problem only through a new analysis, far more profound than any hitherto applied. The Renaissance discovered the role of the activity of man, but failed to recognize the difficult problems inherent in it. Only Bacon saw them, and in one aspect only, that of human intellectual activity. He noticed that man in his activities devised false and illusory ideas to which he afterward succumbed. Bacon's criticism was the first attempt to inquire into the mechanism of human activities and to show that man's creative achievements nurtured a peculiar kind of parasite that hampered his own development. Not only alien and menacing nature, but also man's own products were his enemy. The defeat of those products was very difficult, if only because they were a human creation. The first version of the theory of alienation did not find any followers. In the 18th century, however, conditions arose which again brought the problem to the fore. It seemed probable that such parasites might appear not only in intellectual activities, but in other activities as well, particularly social activities. The attack launched by the ideology of the Enlightenment on the prevailing social system induced philosophers, especially Rousseau, to interpret it as a struggle against the degeneration of social reality at a certain stage of historical development. The new concept made it possible to pass judgment on the fruits of human activities in all fields. It became possible to evaluate history by distinguishing the authentic and valuable products of human activity from the parasites on such activity. To evaluate social life by distinguishing the expression of valuable human activities from valuable human activities' degeneration. The philosophy of man could point both to the ways in which man develops under the influence of history, to those in which he degenerates, to the manner in which society creates man, and the manner in which society destroys man's humanity. The manner in which society creates man, the former contradictions between the empirical and the metaphysical cognitions of man were gone. Scholars seeking to define man according to man's, quote, existence justly criticized those who looked above all for his, quote, essence, since the concepts of essence have always been of a metaphysical nature. Man was in fact richer. Nevertheless, those who considered man on the basis of his existence, erred as well. His existence had hitherto restricted man and prevented man's full development. Now that man was potentially richer, it followed that to understand man was not to determine what man is or should be like, but to recognize man as an active being creating his own world by overcoming what has been created, changing and developing his own creation. Man develops himself and his own existence, and consequently his own essence. This concept of man, as determined by both his activities and his ability to overcome his activities' results, was simultaneously formulated by J. Salaville in France and Wilhelm Humboldt in Germany. J. Salaville expressed it from the point of view of a politician of the French Enlightenment and Revolution, while Wilhelm Humboldt did it in terms of a scholar engaged in the study of culture and in education. Both of them, however, made the same basic discovery: the vision of man as both creator and slave of his own creations. The social consequences of this new philosophy of man were perceived by Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi realized the greatness and also the narrow-mindedness of the Enlightenment and the narrow-mindedness of the French bourgeois revolution. Let me reread them, sorry. Both of them, however, made the same, Humboldt and J. Saville, however, made the same basic discovery: the vision of man as both creator and slave of his own creations. The social consequences of this new philosophy of man were perceived by Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi realized the greatness and also the narrow-mindedness of the Enlightenment and the narrow-mindedness of the French bourgeois revolution. Therefore, Pestalozzi felt that the ideals of bourgeois individualism and bourgeois collectivism were to be equally opposed. In either case, the, quote, true man perishes. Bourgeois individualism is, after all, a kind of egoism, and the bourgeois slogans of patriotism, nationality, and state are merely the same egoism in a collective version. Pestalozzi saw that it was necessary to get beyond the contradiction of the two poles of anti-humanism, individualism, and collectivism that existed in feudal and bourgeois society. Only on the ruins of bourgeois society, when a new social reality suited to the vital needs of all people arises, would it be possible to create the true man, said Pestalozzi, referring back to the great Renaissance discussion of the true man and the real man. By courageously pointing out that the essential cause of the conflict lay with the social class system that entailed the negation of humanity, Pestalozzi raised the kind of considerations Marx referred to in his criticism of the bourgeois ideal of man and that of citizen, hailed by the French Enlightenment. Marx based his theory on the philosophy of man, whose foundations he laid during the course of his famous polemic with Hegel and Hegel's disciples. That philosophy, broaching and solving the problems advanced by the philosophy of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, provided a scientific interpretation of man as an active being, the starting point for contemporary concepts of man. Analyzing the manifold kinds of human activity, Marx showed how the manifold kinds of human activity create a specific environment of human life based on the natural environment and biological needs of the human being, but rising above these preliminary conditions and creating a separate reality that evolves with the development of the material and social activities of man. Man, in every period of that historical development, is molded by this reality and is, at the same time, that reality's creator. Quote, man is man's world, end quote. Going deeper into the definition, Marx revealed the conflicts of that, quote, human world, and the corresponding inner conflicts of man. Man's world develops through contradictions arising principally from the resistance of the consolidated system of social relations and their corresponding ideology to the development of productive forces. The world of social institutions and social ideals created by man becomes a reality independent of man, a world alien to man, a world that imposes its requirements upon him. Labor and social life, inexhaustible sources of man's development, change under these circumstances into factors leading to dehumanization. Thus, everything that determines the historical development of man, man's rise over and above the level of animal vegetation, his increasing wealth of human needs and aspirations, simultaneously becomes a factor depriving him of his humanity and subordinating him to the requirements of capitalist economy. Man's historical development has hitherto been determined by the fact that man is, in his very essence, menaced by the degeneration of those same activities by which he defines himself. The Renaissance writers saw this and pointed out that man's world was, quote, topsy-turvy, but the Renaissance writers did not understand the social mechanism of the conflict. That is why the Renaissance writers' only hope was utopia. Marx explained how under the conditions of capitalist economy and the class system, the true man has to succumb to the, quote, dehumanization process, and the, quote, true society must become a, quote, apparent society. The resources of man and the human community must be destroyed under such conditions. Then the real life of man becomes inhuman. His human aspirations and desires become unreal. That is to say, his human aspirations and desires degenerate. Marx analyzed the world philosophically in order to change the world. His understanding of the world increased as he turned to revolutionary activity, which, being directed against the capitalist system, was to overcome the alienation of labor and social life and the dehumanization of man. What Marx called, quote, revolutionary practice was to be, under the historical conditions that existed, the main factor of social transformation and the principal force liberating man from the slavery of these forms of social and intellectual life to which he had succumbed. Marxist anthropology brought to an end all forms of metaphysical speculation on the essence of man. Marx pointed out that such concepts always involved the unwarranted acceptance as absolute truth of experiences acquired by certain social classes in certain historical periods. In other words, they promoted experiences to the rank of objective and invariable principles. Concepts concerning, quote, the essence of man were not, as Marx pointed out, discoveries of man's true nature to serve as a basis for social, political, and educational activity, but rather expressions of certain socio-political situations made with a view towards their perpetuation. Marx also criticized all attempts to determine man empirically. For all attempts to determine man empirically, like the metaphysical theories, took the historical state of affairs for granted and considered the historical state of affairs immutable. The attempts to determine man empirically wrongly presuppose that people are determined by the way in which they live. They did not perceive any internal contradiction within the human world at different stages of the human world's historical development, or the transformations taking place in man against the background of these contradictions. Marxian anthropology, which determines man by referring to the world of man, and which points to the internal mechanism of the transformation process in that world, showed the mutability of the so-called essence of man. Marxian anthropology, which determines man by referring to the world of man, and which points to the internal mechanism of the transformation process in that world, showed the mutability of the so-called essence of man. It put emphasis on the fact that man was the only being that developed through his commitment to the creation of the objective human world, by succumbing to its requirements and at the same time conquering its decaying forms. The development of man is not a spontaneous and purely spiritual projection of his dreams and wishes, nor is the development of man an expression of the subjective desires of an individual or of a group. The development of man is realized through man's activities, which must pass the test of objective criteria of various kinds, the criterion of truth for scientific activity, of efficiency for technical activity, of form for artistic activity, and of productive forces in social relations for economic activity. Nothing may be facultative. Nothing may be facultative. Nothing may be human license. Only by observing the laws of the objective world can man succeed in his aims and human creations be perpetuated. At the same time, however, courage and creative ability are necessary. Man must not submit to his own creations. Scientists have the right and the duty to reject scientific theories, just as technicians ought to reject solutions already obsolescent. The same applies to organizers of social activities. This duality in the development of man, man's acceptance of the requirements of objective reality, and man's courage in rejecting previous achievements and forms, is a fundamental tenet of Marx's philosophy of man. This dual development is based upon man's social activities. Such activities, being related to the changes in productive forces and the aspirations of the masses, revolutionize stable social institutions and forms, as well as the corresponding social consequences. In the complex processes of destroying the old, creating the new, and preserving the enduring, certain elements complement at the same time contradict one another. These are the requirements of productive forces, and the manifold trends within the economic, quote, base, the various currents in the ideological, quote, superstructure, and general social consciousness. They all create material, social, and spiritual situations replete with internal tensions and contradictions for man.